Howdy folks, and welcome back to War Thunder with the mighty Jingles. This is a simulator battle, and that is a Junkers Ju87 Stuka dive bomber, and it's being flown by the Druid 41 from New Zealand. The Druid had always wanted to try his hand at simulator battles, but he didn't have a joystick. So he tried flying his first few simulator battles using mouse and keyboard, and it wasn't very good. Luckily, he has a friend called Kiwi Skyraider who let him borrow his Logitech Attack 3 joystick. Now, the Attack 3 isn't perfect for simulator battles. It has controls for pitch and roll, but he had to control the rudders using the keyboard. Still, better than just using mouse and keyboard. So this is him playing one of his first simulator battles using a joystick. Now, the thing about watching a simulator battle replay is that most of the issues associated with watching an arcade or realistic battle replay just don't exist. In sim battle replays, you actually get more information than is available when you're actually playing the game, because for one thing, in sim battles, you're restricted to the cockpit view. You don't have any funky external third-person camera like we're watching here. There's also no radar. There are no target markers over any of the aircraft or ground targets. What all of this means in practical terms is that you need to know what enemy aircraft and ground targets look like, because that's the only way you're going to be able to identify them. And the gull wing configuration of the Ju87, with those fixed undercarriage landing wheels, means that this thing, from pretty much just about any angle and any distance, is easily identifiable as a German dive bomber. On the other hand, from more than a kilometre away, an LA-5 doesn't look all that different to a Focke-Wulf 190. So there's a whole range of problems that simulator battle pilots have to contend with that just don't exist in arcade and realistic, before you even begin to get used to handling the complexity of the controls that exist in simulator battles. So you really do have to use your head for more than just flying the aircraft when you're playing simulator battle. Things as simple as navigation, target identification are an order of magnitude harder because the game doesn't help you. Instead, you have to pretty much do more or less exactly what a real pilot would do flying the same aircraft in the same circumstances. Right now, the Druid knows from looking at his map that he's more or less above the target area. Unfortunately, it's covered by thick cloud, so he can't actually see anything down on the ground. And don't forget, this is the view that he's forced to play in. No external third-person camera view in simulator battle. So he kills his throttle, he extends his air brakes, and he very cautiously noses down through the cloud cover. You can see that it is impossible to see where you're going, so you have to fly with one eye on your instruments at all times. Keeping an eye on the artificial horizon, making sure he's not going into too deep a dive. He's not going too fast, he's not going to rip his wings right off. Waiting to break through the cloud cover, one eye on the altimeter, there it is. Okay, he's over the River Volga. And he has overshot the target. He's appeared on the eastern side of the river, the Russian side. So now that he can see where he is, he reorients the aircraft and he picks a ground target. While he's doing all that, let's talk a bit about the aircraft that he's flying. There are certain aircraft that have a very specific place in history, and it's probably true to say that the German Junkers Ju-88 Stuka dive bomber is one of those aircraft. It was almost obsolete when World War II began, but it was highly successful in the initial German Blitzkrieg campaigns, and even today it's instantly recognisable as a symbol of Nazi terror, despite the fact that by the middle of World War II it was completely out of date. In the early 1930s, when Adolf Hitler rose to power and Germany began to rearm, one of the things on the top of Germany's military shopping list was a dive bomber. The German word for dive bomber, and as is typical of German names, they always describe exactly what it is that the thing does. I'll have a stab at pronouncing it. It was a Sturzkampfflugzeug, which literally means diving combat aircraft, or Stuka for short. So technically, the word Stuka could apply to any German dive bomber, but it became associated with this one more than any other. Not a lot of people know that the initial production prototype of the Ju-87, the Ju-87 V1, the power plant wasn't ready in time for trials, so this aircraft first flew with a British Rolls-Royce Kestrel engine. Also, by a strange coincidence, the first production prototype of the Bf-109 suffered the same problem. The power plant wasn't ready in time, and that also flew with a British Rolls-Royce Kestrel engine. So, hooray for Britain and their part in rearming the Nazi war machine. And we went and did it again in the Cold War too, when we sold jet engine technology to the Russians. Oh, Britain, you so silly. But back to the Ju-87. When Germany was shopping around for a new dive bomber in the 1930s, they actually had two requirements. They wanted something quick and nasty that they could use straight away, and this ended up becoming the Henschel 123, which was a biplane single-seater dive bomber. But then they also wanted, at the same time, to spend a bit more money and a bit more thought on designing something that would last them a little bit longer than a single-seater biplane dive bomber, and that's where the Junkers Ju-87 came from. Both aircraft saw service in the Spanish Civil War as part of the Condor Legion, which was a group of volunteers and totally not enlisted and commissioned German military personnel operating under orders. No. They were volunteers, honest, who went to Spain in order to assist the fascist nationalists under Franco in the civil war against the communist republicans. And both aircraft were very, very effective. 5 HS-123s were sent to Spain in 1937, where they had much more success in the close air support role rather than the actual dive bombing role, and they were never really used as dive bombers. The Spaniards loved them, and they kept them when the Condor Legion returned to Germany. Not so the Ju-87. The Ju-87A1s, 3 of which were sent to Spain in order to assist the Condor Legion, were ridiculously effective at devastating Republican shipping and ground targets. Unlike the HS-123s, the Germans wouldn't even let the Spanish look at the Ju-87s, let alone keep them, after their role in the war was over. The Spanish Civil War, however, also saw probably the most infamous use of the Ju-87 in what is generally regarded to be the first time a modern air force conducted terror bombing operations against a defenceless civilian target during the attack on Guernica. This wasn't the first time that the Condor Legion had bombed a civilian target. They also bombed Madrid in 1936, but the bombing of Madrid is generally considered to have just been a warm-up session, a sort of trial run for the real thing in Guernica in 1937, and thousands were killed. It was a very, very successful use of terror bombing as an official tactic. Well, I say official tactic, but the Luftwaffe never officially adopted terror bombing as part of their doctrine. And yet, despite the fact that terror bombing was never an official part of Luftwaffe policy, they seemed to do it an awful lot anyway. In February 1937, Ju-87s bombed convoys of refugees escaping from Malaga. In 1940, Rotterdam was bombed, and columns of refugees escaping from the Blitzkrieg attack on the roads of France were routinely strafed by Ju-87 dive bombers. Between September 1940 and May 1941, 16 British cities were routinely bombed every night by the Luftwaffe during the Blitz, which is kind of strange for an air force that claimed terror bombing was never part of its official tactics. To be fair to the Luftwaffe, the Luftwaffe leadership was divided over the effectiveness of bombing civilian targets as an instrument of warfare. A lot of the Luftwaffe High Command believed that tactics like this merely increased the civilian will to resist rather than eroding it. But the big guns, Goering and Hitler, were all in favour of it. What's ironic, and which is going to spawn countless arguments in the comment section of this and many other YouTube videos, is that while Germany was undoubtedly the first to practice large-scale terror bombing of civilian targets. It kind of backfired on them because the Allies ended up being significantly better at it than they were. A fact which you will find none of the survivors of the firebombings of Dresden and Tokyo willing to argue with. Also, for an air force that officially denied it practiced terror bombing at all, it went to an inordinate amount of trouble to make the Stuka into as terrifying a weapon as it possibly could be. The Stuka was fitted with things called Jericho Trumpets. It refers to the biblical story where the walls of Jericho were blown down by blowing on trumpets. These were devices, sirens, that were fitted to the undercarriage of the Ju87, and when it went into a sufficiently steep and fast dive, the airflow through the sirens would produce the screaming sound effect that has been associated with the Stuka dive bomber since time immemorial. By the time of the outbreak of World War II, there were still some people who had doubts about the effectiveness of the Ju87, but in September 1939, the Stuka proved its worth in the invasion of Poland. The Luftwaffe's 9 Stuka groups had a total of 322 Ju87Bs in service for the campaign, but the Stuka was devastating in Poland, performing strikes at the opening of the offensive, sinking most of the Polish Navy's ships, almost completely annihilating a Polish infantry division that was caught changing trains, and smashing Polish resistance in front of German ground forces. It was part of the emerging Blitzkrieg tactics developed by General Heinz Guderian. Fast-moving armoured columns, moving rapidly through enemy defences, communicating with Stukas by radio for the removal of obstacles to the advance. And it worked. And it worked again in France, when the phony war ended and the Blitzkrieg resumed, utterly smashing any kind of organised resistance against the German advance. But the thing about the Blitzkrieg use of the Stuka was that it was effective, but it was only effective against ineffective Air Force resistance. The invasion of France in May 1940 was the high point of the Stuka's success. During the Battle of Britain, over the summer of 1940, it was far too vulnerable to Royal Air Force fighters. 1 out of 5 Stukas were shot down, and it was completely withdrawn from the Battle of Britain on the 19th of August. There was a faction in the Luftwaffe that recognised even before the outbreak of war that the Stuka was an obsolete aircraft and was likely to suffer heavily in the face of effective air opposition, but Reichsmarschall Goering, head of the Luftwaffe, sided with the advocates of the Stuka. Now, however, the beliefs of the doubters were starting to prove justified. The writing was on the wall for the Ju87, but its career was far from over. I just want to interrupt the history lesson here for a moment, just to concentrate on what the Druid is actually doing here. I was talking earlier on about the fact that this is a simulator battle, and it's very, very hard to identify the targets that you should be going for. You have to actually pay attention to the map. And things like this. There are a bunch of landing craft approaching Stalingrad. Are they German? Are they Russian? Well, they're approaching from the east bank of the Volga, so they're unlikely to be friendly, and they are in fact about to open fire on him. But this is one of the things that you need to understand when you're playing simulator battle. Game doesn't tell you which targets you should be shooting at. You have to, well, use something other than target markers to find the targets for you, because there aren't any target markers. If you're flying around and there's one enemy fighter left to kill, and you have no idea where he is, look down. If you can see anti-aircraft fire going up, there's a fairly good bet that he's being shot at by the AI. Head in that direction. All kinds of things that you just don't need to do in arcade and realistic battle that are vitally important in simulator battle to achieve any kind of success. Things that real pilots would have had to do. But back to the history lesson. And yes, by the fall of France and the Battle of Britain, the Ju87 was already obsolete in the face of effective air opposition. But the Luftwaffe didn't have anything to replace it with. The Ju88 twin-engine medium bomber could also work as a dive bomber, but it wasn't available in anything like the numbers necessary to replace the Ju87s. And so Junkers kept upgrading the Ju87 in an effort to extend its useful service life. The Ju87C, for example, ironically enough, was a naval version of the Ju87. It was designed to be operated from German aircraft carriers such as the Graf von Zeppelin. Unfortunately, Germany never built any of its aircraft carriers, and so some of the Ju87C0 pre-production models actually saw service in Poland, where they bombed Warsaw. The curious thing about the Ju87C was that it was able to jettison its main landing gear, and German propaganda played up pictures of Ju87s flying back with their landing gear removed in an effort to suggest that they'd been shot off, but the Stuka was so tough that it made it back home anyway. Another Ju87C was fitted with a recoilless forward-firing 88mm gun under the fuselage. The weapon actually fired a counterweight backwards to balance the recoil of the gun. But this entire scheme came to nothing when the gun misfired, ripped itself out of the belly of the aircraft. Somehow the pilot was actually able to land safely. Another version of the Ju87, the Ju87R, was a long-range anti-shipping version. The R stood for Reichweite, or range. It had fuel tanks in the outer wings. It could carry two 300-litre external tanks, although it was restricted to carrying a single 250-kilogram or 550-pound bomb when it was using the external fuel tanks. In all other respects, they were identical to the Ju87B2, and the subvariants in the R series differed only in very minor details, such as radio fit and tropicalization fits. One was tested with the Dobas collapsible cargo container, which looked like a chunk cut out of very fat airfoil fitted between the landing gear. It was intended to haul useful equipment when Stukas redeployed to another site or for use in emergency cargo missions. It never entered service. The Ju87R was built in limited numbers, but some took part in the German invasion of Norway in April 1940. The Royal Navy was surprised by the appearance of the Ju87R, and this type of aircraft sank the Royal Navy destroyers HMS Afridi, Bison and Grom, as well as the anti-aircraft ship Bittern. Bittern's sister ship, the Black Swan, was hit by a Stuka, but the bomb was dropped too low, armed too late, and passed through the ship before exploding. The Black Swan survived. The Stuka also achieved notable success in the Mediterranean theatre, where they badly damaged the Royal Navy carrier HMS Illustrious on the 10th of January 1941, and sank the cruiser HMS Southampton on the 11th of January. It also put in very useful service in the capture of the Balkans and Crete in the spring of 1941. They devastated Royal Navy vessels during the Crete campaign, helping to send the cruiser HMS Gloucester to the bottom, also sinking the destroyers Greyhound, Kelly and Kashmir, and badly damaging several other Royal Navy ships. It was also highly effective in North Africa, at least at first. Once again, the weakness of the Stuka was that it was very, very effective, as long as no effective air opposition existed. With the invasion of the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941, it was as destructive as ever, leading the Blitzkrieg deep into the USSR, while Soviet air power was completely crushed. It was at this time that the definitive version of the Ju87 was produced, one that you can see Druid flying here, the Ju87 D. It had a much more powerful 1400 horsepower Junkers Jumo engine, which allowed it to carry more armour and heavier weaponry, as well as more fuel. Enough Ju87Ds were built to completely replace the Ju87B in frontline service. The D series was mostly used in the close support role because it was tough and it could carry and deliver a very heavy bomb load, but it had to dodge enemy fighters by hiding at low level if fighter cover wasn't available. By this time the sunshine days of the Stuka were over. In the first year of the war in the East, the Red Army Air Force had been completely ineffective, but by mid-1942 Soviet air power was beginning to recover. At the same time, Allied air power in North Africa was beginning to make itself felt painfully against the Ju87. By 1943, the Stuka was on the defensive on all fronts, completely unable to survive in the face of effective fighter opposition. At this stage, even the most passionate advocates of the Ju87 had to admit that it was long past its sell-by date, and so the Luftwaffe started looking for a replacement. This was going to be the Me-210, which ended up entering service as the Me-410, but again, far too little, far too late. So once again, despite the fact that it was clearly an obsolete aircraft, production of the Ju87 increased. The problem for the Stuka pilots was that at this stage of the war, by mid-1943, with such a hostile air environment, they were almost completely limited to flying night operations. Compounded by the fact that the Ju87 D5 had absolutely no modifications or optimizations to improve its ability to fly at night, they were limited to coming in low and slow and dropping anti-personnel bombs on groups of incautious Allied soldiers, a tactic that they actually learned from the Russians earlier on in the war, where they'd been moderately successful at doing this in little PO2 biplanes. This wasn't quite the end of the Stuka development, however. Because attacking moving tanks with conventional bombs was inaccurate, the Luftwaffe tried to find a way of improving the Stuka's anti-tank capability. In the summer of 1942, they tried fitting a Ju87 D3 with a 37mm anti-tank cannon. This resulted in the Ju87 G, which had a BK 3.7-inch anti-tank gun with a 6-round magazine mounted under the wing, outside each main landing gear assembly. The first of these Panzerjäger Stukas reached the Russian front in October 1943. They were successful at first, racking up large numbers of Soviet tank kills, but while the guns had a good punch and they were accurate, the pods that they were mounted in were large, bulky, and added drag, which didn't do anything to improve the Stuka's already poor performance. This, of course, made them easy prey for Red Army Air Force fighters, and so once again, by the end of 1944, most Stukas were once again relegated to night operations, with daytime close support operations mostly being flown by heavily armoured versions of the Focke-Wulf 190. As usual, there were never enough of these to go around. But one Stuka group still conducted daylight anti-tank operations. And this was, of course, the 3rd Air Force Stuka Group 2, commanded by the legendary ORAC Rudolf, the most decorated German serviceman of the entire Second World War. Rudolf was born in 1916 in what's today southwestern Poland. When he initially joined the Luftwaffe, he was very slow to learn new techniques, and he was considered unsuitable for combat flying, and was initially posted to a reconnaissance squadron. During the Polish campaign, he got so sick and tired of sitting in the back of a reconnaissance aircraft as an observer that he put in repeated requests to be transferred to a dive bombing squadron, requests which were eventually approved. However, his poor reputation preceded him. He was thought of as being a bad pilot, and so he continued to sit out the majority of the Crete campaign, the Mediterranean campaign, in non-combat roles, and it wasn't until the invasion of Russia when he finally got his chance to fly his first combat mission. And within a month of his first mission, he'd earned the Iron Cross First Class. A month later, he and another Stuka pilot sank the Soviet battleship Marat using 1,000-pound bombs in an attack on the harbour at Kronstadt. Within 6 months, he'd flown 400 combat missions. By February 1943, he was the first pilot in history to fly 1,000 combat missions. This was around about the time where he started flying the 37mm anti-tank gun armed G version of the Ju-87, and through the Battle of Kursk and up towards the end of 1943, he claimed 100 tank kills. Rudolf was considered so important for propaganda purposes to the German war effort that Hitler personally ordered him not to fly any more combat missions. Rudolf refused. At one point he was wounded in the leg. He carried on flying combat missions with the leg in a plaster cast. Towards the end of the war, his aircraft was hit by a 40mm shell. The injuries that he suffered as a result of this resulted in his leg being amputated below the knee. It didn't stop him from flying combat missions. Rudolf survived the war, and in 1948 he moved to Argentina. He died on the 18th of December 1982, age 66, and he's buried near Dornhausen in West Germany. Despite flying an aircraft that was obsolete and ridiculously vulnerable to enemy fighter aircraft, he was never once shot down by another pilot, only by ground fire. I hope you've enjoyed today's video and hopefully learned something from it, and thank you to the Druid 41 for sending the replay in, and Kiwi Sky Raider for lending him the joystick that enabled him to fly this simulator battle. Take care, and I'll catch you next time.